rather than the pandemic opening up a transformation of our schools to being more holistic and supportive and welcoming environments. Instead, we're seeing an intensification of some of the same kinds of discipline and policing practices that have sent young people on the road from a school to jail before.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. The school-to-prison pipeline refers to the phenomenon of criminalizing what was once routinely handled as student discipline. Over 1.5 million students attend schools with police but no counselors. Students with disciplinary infractions are now being sent into the criminal justice system instead of to guidance counselors or principals. In schools where there are police, also known as school resource officers or SROs, students are 5 times more likely to be arrested and charged. In response, there's been a national campaign to end the presence of police in schools, including in Vermont, where several school boards, including Burlington, have recently voted to end their police contracts. The school-to-prison pipeline has now spawned a new variant, the pandemic-to-prison pipeline. Professor Mark Warren and Jonathan Stith argue that during COVID schooling, schools are responding to a student mental health crisis with harsh discipline that has fallen hardest on students of color. Mark Warren is professor of public policy and public affairs at UMass Boston and the author of the new book, Willful Defiance, The Movement to Dismantle the School-to-Prison Pipeline. Jonathan Stith is the national director of the Alliance for Educational Justice and co-director of the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools. I began by asking Professor Warren to explain the pandemic-to-prison pipeline.
So, the pandemic has really caused a lot of trauma and a lot of stress, economic hardship, family loss for young people, disruption of schooling. And, young people are coming back to school in those kinds of conditions. And instead of getting a support, an investment of support, what we've been starting to see is the intensification of discipline practices in school and policing practices in schools. So if minor incidents break out of fights or things that have to do with just the social emotional state of teenagers and young people at this point, instead of seeking for restorative kinds of practices and things that would really help build a strong school community, instead police are being called in and there are renewed calls for policing in schools. And so that's why we're calling it the pandemic to prison pipeline, rather than the pandemic opening up a transformation of our schools to being more holistic and supportive and welcoming environments. Instead, we're seeing an intensification of some of the same kinds of discipline and policing practices that have sent young people on the road from a school to jail before.
Jonathan, you've described in this latest article about the response to the racial justice movement following the George Floyd murder, that there has now been a white lash. What are the different aspects of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen in this kind of return has been the kind of sensationalization and criminalization of young people's mental health crisis in this returning under pandemic. Again, as Mark talked about, kind of year 3 learning under a pandemic for like the high school students that we organize with, like that's most of their high school experience, right? And so what we're seeing, particularly, I think we saw it most clearly in the recent governor race here in Virginia, where these fights were they were making the news daily, and they were used then as a justification to call for the reinstatement of police in schools, particularly in Alexandria, Virginia, where one of our groups in the campaign, Tenants Workers United, the young people there had mounted a campaign that removed policing from their schools. And when they talk about what happened, it was basically Black and brown students in the meeting with angry white parents who were calling for, again, the end of mask mandates and a return to policing in schools. And so we kind of really began to understand what we saw in Virginia. We're also seeing in other parts of the country, again, this kind of lifting up these fights that are happening in the schools as a means to call for more policing and justifying the further criminalization of Black and brown students.
That's interesting. I mean, we see these anti-mask protests at school board meetings. This has become, almost a daily occurrence that people are sharing videos of parents out of control. But the other part is less visible. The link between that and the calling for crackdowns on students and particularly students of color. What is the connection, do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, we think it's a direct backlash to, again, the gains that young people, black, brown young people in their communities gained under kind of after the George Floyd murder and the decision around by the Minneapolis first University of Minnesota board to sever its contract with Minneapolis police, and then followed by the school board, again, kind of opened a wave of school districts all across the country. I think our last count was 130 school districts ending their contracting with policing, and a direct link between the Black Lives Matter movement and police-free schools. And again, when we reflect back to kind of all the protests were happening in DC, one of the things that really had caught our attention is that somebody, it wasn't us, had put up police-free schools on the actual White House grounds as part of kind of the art in the takeover. And so I think what we've seen or experiencing is that our movement is now is tied to Black Lives Matter, and the backlash that we've seen coming from Black Lives Matter now has been played out. I think it's also connected to these fights around critical race theory that has also been part of this kind of what we've been calling this white lash kind of post the Trump presidency.
The attacks on critical race theory, we see that the new governor of Virginia, Youngkin, who was just elected, has just passed a law banning the teaching of critical race theory. And to my knowledge, critical race theory is not taught in Virginia public schools. It's very hard to fathom. So we're banning something that isn't happening. Jonathan, enlighten us as to what you think the real force behind this is.
Yeah, I think it feels like just a return or a tightening of or a kind of like they were all in DC, and now they've all returned back to their communities trying to figure out kind of what the set of next fights are. But it is an interesting battle to be fighting around something that does not even exist, right? Like most folks who do any kind of education justice would say that there is no critical race theory taught in schools, and it's kind of these fighting of these shadows that are kind of really distracting us from, I think, what Mark had opened up around kind of these real critical issues around how untransformed our schools are. And again, part of what we would say is part of a right-wing agenda and kind of the remounting of their fight back through these kind of sets of issues.
Mark Warren, in your new book, Willful Defiance, you talk about the many ways that Black students are far more likely than white students to be suspended, expelled, and arrested. For people who are not familiar with the basics of that literature around the school to prison pipeline, just explain what you understand of the risks posed by police in schools and the kind of discipline that is meted out to students of color on a routine basis.
Right. Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't really understand, a lot of people who maybe live in more whiter, more affluent communities don't really understand what is happening in the schools that are serving, or are supposed to be serving low-income students of color, particularly Black and brown students in this country. And, starting in the 90s, as chart in the book Willful Defiance, there was a rise of zero tolerance discipline policies in our schools and a rise of armed security guards and police in our schools. Prior to the 90s, there were only about 100 police officers in any schools across the country. By the early 2000s, there were 16,000 police officers or armed security guards in our schools. Prior to the 90s, there were some students were suspended, but it was usually for very egregious conduct. But starting in the 90s, as part of what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow, the rise of mass criminalization in our society, this same kind of zero tolerance attitude was taken into our schools, and students started to be suspended for things like willful defiance, what we call the title of the book. So if you're not wearing your cap on the right way, you refuse to take your hat off, or you challenge the textbook that you're being taught in your history class because it's published in Texas and you don't think it's reflecting the history of your community, well, then you're being willfully defiant or disrupting schools or willfully disruptive. And every year, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students, mainly Black and brown students, and those with disabilities, are being suspended every year for things like willful defiance. Once young students are suspended once, they're more likely to spend it again, and then more likely to end up failing to graduate from high school. And that puts these students, particularly, as I said, African-American, Latinx students, on the road to prison. If you are a Black man in this country without a high school degree, your chance of ending up in prison at some point in your life is 2/3. So in other words, 2/3 of all Black men without a high school degree in this country end up in prison at one point in their lives. 1/3 are in prison at any one time. I mean, these are staggering numbers. And at the same time, there is no evidence at all that the presence of police in schools actually makes schools safer. On the other hand, they are often the roots to students having their first interaction with the criminal justice system. In fact, we say in the book, mass incarceration starts in school. It's the place that many, many young people, particularly Black and brown youth, have their first experience with police and are often arrested right in school and sent into the criminal justice system. And what we are saying is that, there has to be a transformation in this. This is affecting hundreds of thousands of average, good kids who are often doing normal teenage behavior. And instead of being treated with humanity and respect, it's part of a system of discipline and control. And it's keeping our communities either in prison, poor, and lacking in democratic rights, often when they end up out of prison, still with a criminal record.
Jonathan, you mentioned about the mental health crisis among young people now during the pandemic, and how this is being met with not more school counselors, but more school police. Can you say a little bit more about what you understand of this mental health crisis, particularly in communities of color?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think we're all under under some kind of mental health crisis. Again, all of us trying to adjust, and it has felt like, in the conversation and dialogue, young people have been left out. Particularly left out have been Black and brown young people in the conversation. And what we know before the pandemic was that many of the schools that our young people attended were under-resourced, kind of over-policed, as kind of the saying goes, and didn't have even the right set of things to welcome students or keep students safe under COVID. Now they're returning to schools that are untransformed, that the discipline is tighter. They haven't seen each other for 3 years, trying to learn with a mask on, probably still trying to teach to the test under these conditions. So it's just a tremendous amount of pressure. What we're hearing again from young people in cities that even won police-free schools. Again, I think this was the case. What we heard in Alexandria is that the mental health supports never appeared. They won more counseling, more restorative justice, and those things haven't appeared. What has appeared has been more policing. That's what they've seen as been the response to this crisis. And again, the call for mental health supports from Black and brown students and even white students is not a new call, right? I think one of the transformative moments around Stoneman Douglas was the call of those students and the March for Our Lives calling for mental health supports and not calling for policing as an answer. And what did we see? We saw school districts again throw billions of dollars into policing as the only solution. And so again, we find ourselves at a moment where again, young people are crying out all over the country. The majority of public students in public schools are Black and brown students, crying out for a different response from school systems. And they're again being met with harsh punitive punishment and policing, which is the one and the same. I'm being redundant.
Mark, this term willful defiance, that's the title of your book. there have been instances in Los Angeles, for example, where that term, and also you have to really marvel at that term, willful defiance, as any parent knows, describes normal teenage behavior. One might say healthy teenage behavior in many instances. But where this term is removed as a reason for school discipline, as I believe has been done in Los Angeles and other places, what happens?
Right. So, I think that we've been talking about, the problem and the depth of the school to prison pipeline. But this book, and actually Jonathan himself as an organizer, is really involved in a movement that has really worked to challenge and dismantle the system. And there have been really important victories in this movement. So you mentioned one of them. In Los Angeles, a coalition of youth organizing groups supported by parent organizing groups won a change in the school discipline policy in Los Angeles in 2013, and they eliminated willful defiance as a cause for suspension. Prior to that, every year, there were 75,000 lost days of instruction due to suspensions for willful defiance. And within a few years of the passage of this change in discipline policy, that number had dropped to 5,600. So that is a really dramatic change. And we've seen this, and then it was passed, a coalition formed to pass a change in the state law in California, banning suspensions for willful defiance, first from K to 3, and then extended up to 8th grade. And we have seen suspensions across the state of California drop, I think, by 46% since then. So, it is possible to really challenge these discipline policies and to change them. And that is the work that I think a lot of organizing groups have been doing. And now the new frontier in that is the removal of police from schools, as we've been talking about.
Well, Jonathan, talk about the movement to remove police from schools, to change standards of school discipline. Where do we find this movement, and what are some of the indicators of its impact?
Absolutely. I think there's the National Campaign for Police Free Schools, which is a kind of national network of about 30 campaigns that are leading efforts like we talked about in Los Angeles and Oakland. And many of them are in different phases. Groups that have won, like the Black Organizing Project in Oakland, are in the kind of implementation, transforming stage. And like we've been saying, winning police-free schools, winning the removal or ending the contract with policing is just the beginning of the struggle for police-free schools. And that our call is to really look at how we dismantle school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, how we end demilitarization of our schools, and ending student surveillance, and building towards a liberatory education. And so groups are in various stages. Some groups who were not able to achieve police-free schools, kind of this last opening, are rebuilding their efforts, particularly in New York City. We'll be seeing some fights. And then also, I think across the South, where we've been in contact with groups who've been really trying to figure out how to build new campaigns around police-free schools. I think there's more work to be done at the federal level. Now, as we've seen, the return of students to school have led to a return of what we call assault acts. And this is when a school resource officer hurts a student for any reason. In December, before school ended, there were 8 assaults across the country by a school resource officer, by a school resource officer against a student. We most recently had the deaths of students, Mona Rodriguez in California, most recently 18-year-old Fanta Bitley, I hope I'm saying their name right, 8-year-old who was again killed by SRO at the school site. Both of these incidents trying to break up fights, right? This very thing that we're calling police in to do, they're killing our students in their response. And so we see groups again kind of organizing around trying to stop the assault that's happening, again, waging these transformative campaigns to try to change schooling practice and culture. And then we have the other practices around kind of restorative justice and transformative justice. which the young people call kind of youth sanctuary strategies. And they're really into how do they create safety for themselves that is not reliant on the state, not reliant on policing. And that is, again, a lot of the stuff that we've seen around restorative justice, circle holding, peacekeeping, and really figuring out for themselves how can they build peace with each other in their schools for the sake of its transformation and winning police-free schools. So folks should check out the website, policefreeschools.org, for, again, a list of all the amazing organizing that's happening across the country.
Mark, I'm curious, you mentioned there is no research-based evidence that the presence of police improves safety in schools. That's pretty astonishing, because the conventional wisdom is that having an officer in uniform and with a weapon keeps the peace. But you say there's nothing to indicate that.
No, actually, there isn't. There's no evidence for it. And, even I think people even see that in the case of the, mass school shootings. In many of those cases, there have been armed police officers or security officers on those campuses, and that didn't prevent the shootings from happening. But that's the other side of the coin here, is that part of the call for the presence of police came as a result of some of these, really tragic cases of school shootings. But these school shootings typically occur in whiter, rural, or ex-urban communities, and yet the presence of police was radically escalated in our urban communities, serving Black and brown students, which are not the sites of school shootings. And so then the question is, well, what are these police doing in those schools? And it turns out, when people have done the research, that the vast majority of what they're doing is being called in by teachers and administrators to handle, what again are minor behavioral issues. I mean, one of the famous cases that got really fueled the police-free schools movement was the assault at Spring Valley, where a police officer assaulted Shakira, a Black high school student girl, for allegedly refusing to hand in her cell phone to a teacher. How is that a criminal offense? How is a police officer being called into a classroom because a student refuses to hand over, even if she did, refuses to hand over their cell phone to their teacher? And yet that is the vast majority of what police officers are doing in our schools. And then that often leads to cases of police violence, or stopping students. Another case in Philadelphia, which I know Jonathan can speak to, a member of the Alliance for Educational Justice who was stopped in the hall because he didn't have a pass to go to the bathroom, and assaulted by a security guard and police officer. So this is what's happening. And instead, what we find is that when people do study this, the impact of having police in schools is that it increases the chance of students being arrested and ending up in the juvenile justice system, because police are in school interacting with students over a minor behavioral issues.
Jonathan, we just have a minute left, and I wonder if we could finish by talking about the alternatives to criminalization, the efforts at restorative or transformative justice that have been put in place instead of police.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times folks ask, what's the alternative? We already know what the alternative is. We've seen it in action. We know it works. And in many cases, those solutions have been stripped away from students. So really looking at the work that have been done by Oakland Restorative Justice, RJOY, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, as an example. Again, we're in schools. Chicago, at one point, as a school system, had a robust restorative justice system that was, again, creating and generating peace. Again, there's so much research out there that talks about how the environment is positively impacted by these practices, that there should be no real question about the effectiveness of these practices. And again, the only reason why they are in question was under the DeVos administration. They were blamed for Stoneman Douglas, right? This restorative justice program that the young person was never in. So we understand that the solutions to the problem of policing already exist. They're in the hearts and minds of students. They've already had practices that have shown that these are effective ways to create safety that don't involve policing. And I always like to ground us in the vision of a young person, George Carter III out of New Orleans, who we lost to intercommunal violence. And he always talked about schools that had mood detectors instead of metal detectors, schools that had strawberry gardens instead of suspension rooms. And we can understand that as the fundamental vision of young people around what school safety looks like and what they are imagining. This can guide us towards the solutions that will make a difference and again, generate real safety in our community and for our students.
Well, Jonathan Stith and Mark Warren, I want to thank you both for joining us on the Vermont Conversation.
Thank you.
That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. You can hear this and all programs at vtdigger.org/Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.